Nothing controversial in there is what the president says. Matt Dowd, would you give us your perspective? Because there was also some mention there of increasing taxes on the wealthy, very controversial. Some mention there of collective bargaining and not trying to inhibit the growth of the unions as well, very controversial. What is this biggest sticking point in what you heard from the president's plan tonight?
Well, I was surprised that there was not more of a reach for more cooperation language. It was, here's what we need to do. You've supported it before. Now vote on it and vote for it. And there was less of like, how are we going to, what's the consensus on this? I'm going to work with you. We're going to get this done. We have to get this done. The education thing surprised me in one degree because I thought he was concentrating totally on jobs. But I think it actually was a smart thing because a huge part of where the American public is on this is they're worried about their kids. And it's the first time in history of our country where this generation of folks, the adults, do not believe their children will be better off than they are.
Right.
And that has caused much disillusionment, much sense of where we are as a country. And that fact, I think, is why he touched on the education thing. I think this speech, as Juliana mentioned, alluded to, felt like a speech he would give on the stump, or felt like a speech he could have given in times past with a few minor things. I don't think this is going to have a lot of effect. I'm really curious to see how the market reacts tomorrow to this speech. My guess is there's going to be a lot of kind of ho-hum reaction to this, like what are we actually going to get done? But I was surprised he didn't have more. This was more of a lecturing speech and less of a consensus-building speech, in my view.
Now, you mentioned education, and looking at the broad outlines here, the president's proposing to spend $30 billion on modernizing schools. That's trying to refurbish infrastructure, not necessarily start from scratch there, but also called for retraining of workers. I mean, one of the prime challenges that economists talk so much about is not just the fact that people don't have jobs, it's how long they're continuing to go without one. I mean, you have a 20% chance of getting a job within a month of being laid off from the workforce right now. So, Matt, how does he retrain that quickly? Well, how do you get this done? How do you get this implemented?
I mean, the difficulty is how do you take a carpenter and make him a computer programmer in any sort of short time frame, and in what their age they are. I think he talked about education. As everybody knows, we're post-Labor Day. Most parents are bringing their kids back. College students are going back to education. But there's a huge adult workforce that's basically gone back to school because they know the jobs that they had before aren't going to be there again. The difficulty is many of these things will not help in the short term, as we all know. These are long-term fixes. They certainly won't help politically in the short term. And economically, the education stuff, while very laudable and I think needs to be done, are not going to be short-term fixes to the economic problem we face in this country today.
No, and that idea you just hit on, how do you turn a carpenter into a computer programmer? It's a great turn of phrase, and it's really something that actually economists have been struggling with here, is how much of the joblessness is due to the crisis in the economy and how much of it is due to globalization, due to increased productivity, due to technology that has essentially helped innovate our way out of jobs, or at least traditional ones. Big debate over what the new standard of joblessness should be. So I want to bring in more voices to this conversation as we try to analyze the president's speech and these proposals to see whether they actually will do what they're intended, stimulate growth. We've got former Republican Senator John Sununu here in Bloomberg Studios in Washington with me. He spent 12 years representing New Hampshire in both chambers of Congress. Also joining us from California is Christina Romer, joining us from the campus of California, Berkeley. She was, of course, President Obama's chief economist during the first 2 years of his term. Welcome to the show. Ms. Romer, I want to ask you here, one of the prime challenges in talking about this $450 billion plan is whether or not you can consider it stimulus. You've said in the past that plan back in 2009 that you were part of, $800 billion wasn't enough. Is $450 billion enough right now?
Well, I certainly think it is a wonderful action to be taking. I thought, the president had an incredible urgency in his speech, and I think there's a reason for that. The economy is clearly struggling, as he described it, an economy at risk of stalling, and he is proposing some very bold actions. And this is the size of action that I think is appropriate and could absolutely move the dial and could absolutely have an impact on job creation and unemployment.
Would you venture to say just what sort of job creation it would have? I know Mark Zandi had done some analysis here and says he expects us to add, if implemented, about 2% to GDP and move employment by about 1 percentage point. Would you agree with that analysis?
And I've heard, I remember him saying something about bringing the unemployment rate also down. And I think those are
right.
certainly in the ballpark. I haven't run the numbers, but I certainly think that, what that's saying is this is big enough to actually do something, to actually put a substantial number of people back to work. And that is the number one thing the president had to offer. And I feel he did that very, very well.
Secretary Sununu, I'm going to bring you, Secretary, excuse me, I just promoted you. Senator Sununu.
That's a demotion. Thank you very much. We'll have Secretary Clinton on here. We can have a debate about whether it's a promotion or not. Please, go ahead.
Well, maybe we'll talk about your job prospects some other time. But let's talk about the job prospects for the immediate term here. And what we were just hearing about the economics of this really in many ways might be frustrated by the politics of it. Because the president did today say all of these things I'm proposing will be paid for. But he didn't really tell us how, did he?
In many ways, I think that automatically sets up a roadblock for him in getting this done. To stand up and say, this is a big package, an important package, and we can talk about the substance. It's $450 billion, and it's paid for. And here's how it's paid for. I'm going to tell you to find a way to pay for it. That's exactly what he said. The special committee is going to be asked to find another $450 billion on top of the $1.5 trillion they've already been asked to do. And whether or not it can be done, I think there's going to be a bipartisan reaction that that's not really how a president should lead. And I think it's going to create a little tension with lawmakers.
No, you're right to say adding to the burden there, but we did hear, from the president that a week from now he will be putting forth perhaps some proposals in there.
So the check's in the mail, and maybe he'll come forward with some tough thoughts and some tough decisions and tough choices, and be sort of a constructive part of that special committee process. But he had an opportunity, if you just go back only a few weeks, to cut a deal with the Republican leadership in the House that would have gained much more than what's on the table now, and they got hung up over tax cuts. I hope that's not the case again here.
One of the things that we have heard at least some hint at bipartisan support for is what is happening with payroll taxes for employers and for employees. Mr. If I could bring you back into the conversation here, what does moving the proposal, deepening that cut for employees from 2 to 3%, how much cash does that put in the wallet of an American worker?
I think the answer is about $500 is the increase over what they got last year. So as I remember, last year it was about $1,000, and this year they're talking about $1,500. So it's real money in real people's pockets. So I think that could be important. I also think on the business side, I have been a big proponent for the kind of new jobs tax credit or a payroll tax cut that the president was talking about. The estimates that we did back in the administration when I was there suggested that's something that could have a really big bang for the buck in terms of employment, in terms of really convincing small firms to hire. And I think that's wonderful that that's there.
I think Christina is right on that point, and I think that's one of the proposals here that probably has the best chance of being embraced by both sides, is not just to extend the payroll tax cut for employees, put more money in their pockets and hopefully drive some demand that way, but cut payroll taxes for employers. From an economic standpoint, that's the best.
Lowering the cost of labor.
Lowering the cost of bringing on that incremental worker, lowering the cost of labor. And it might not look exactly like what the president's proposed here, but I think that's a coupled provision that would be most likely to be embraced by Congress.
And I would add here, I think John's right. And on this issue, the president has more leverage than he did during the debt ceiling fight, because basically he was at their mercy. If they were going to say no, he didn't want the debt ceiling to collapse. This time, I think it's going to be hard not to do that tax cut. And so the issue will be, how do you pay for it? But that's where the president has some leverage, and I think particularly with the House Republicans, he used that line, now's not the time to carve out an exception. So I think on the issue of the payroll tax, I would be surprised if something close to what he's proposing isn't enacted.
Well, it's interesting to have both putting money in the pocket of the consumer, get them to spend it, and putting money in the pocket, perhaps, of a company, lowering the cost of hiring someone.